Hello again. In this lesson we are going to look at another irrealist theory, Richard Hare's Prescriptivism. Irrealism, as you will recall, is a form of moral subjectivism or non-cognitivism, and it suggests that there are no such things as moral facts. So prescriptivism is an irrealist theory because it bases its position on the idea that there are no moral facts, and indeed argues for it. However, there are some stark contrasts between Hare's approach and that of A.J. Ayer's Emotivism, and we'll see some of these in a minute. But let's first look at the basics of prescriptivism. In prescriptivism, moral words, for example, right and wrong, are neither just descriptive nor emotive in meaning. Okay, so we're not just talking about describing a particular event as wrong, and neither are we just talking about that description being an expression of emotion or the expression of a deeply held attitude. They are also prescriptive, so they are also, if you like, orders, rather like a doctor's prescription. Right? He or she is prescribing a particular course of medicine, and in this sense, prescriptivism is prescribing a particular course of moral action. Prescriptivism therefore allows for a greater role for reason in moral discussion, and you'll remember from Emotivism that there was little room for reasoning in moral discussion. It really was just a case of opposing views based on one's feelings. So if I say, for example, leave the room, I'm telling you to do something, right? It's an order, it's a command. If I say eating meat is wrong, I'm basically telling you not to eat meat. So I'm saying don't eat meat. Don't eat meat is a moral imperative. As you know, an imperative is an order. All right? In the same way that leave the room is an order, it's an imperative. Okay? As such, our moral judgments are, according to Hare, subjective imperatives. Now, it's very, very important that you do not get Hare mixed up with Kant, okay? For two reasons. The first is that prescriptivism is a meta-ethical theory. It's not attempting to tell you what is right and wrong, right? It is a theory that explains what is going on when we make a moral judgment. Whereas Kant, with his categorical imperative, is saying this is right or this is wrong, okay, depending on whether it passes contradiction of concept, contradiction of will, and doesn't treat people as means to ends. Okay, so do please try to not get those confused. So let's just have a look at some statements, and I just want you to pause the video whilst you try to think of differences and similarities, perhaps, between these 6 statements. So, for example, compare "it is wrong to eat meat" with "it is bad to eat meat," or "terrorism is always wrong," or "terrorism is bad." So I want you to just pause the video and compare these statements on paper, all right, and think of as many comparisons, perhaps similarities and differences as well, as you can. So essentially, those statements exemplify the difference between commanding and commending, or commanding and condemning, if we're talking about something that's particularly negative. All right. We use the words right and wrong to command, according to Hare, all right, but we use good and bad just to commend or condemn. Okay, so for example, if I said eating meat is bad, I wouldn't be saying necessarily that one shouldn't eat meat. I would just say For example, it's bad because it might raise your blood pressure. Or if I say eating meat is good, I'm not saying it's morally right. I might just be saying that it's quite tasty. All right. Either way, it's a commendation or a condemnation, but not an actual command. It's not an imperative. So there's a difference, Hare believes, between a good action and a right action. A good action commends an action without necessarily commanding it. All right. And apologies, this should be and should be an. So a good action commends an action without necessarily commanding it. Again, there's another similarity or a potential confusion point with Kant here, because Hare also talks about universalization. But once again, please be aware that there is a huge difference between these two philosophers. So let's look at this idea now that Hare makes a distinction between. He says there's a distinction between universalization and standards. All right, so whenever we apply a particular standard, we are committed to making the same judgment in relation to the same stuff. All right. So if I judge two pieces of chocolate to be good and bad respectively, there must be some relevant difference between them to make them good and bad. Maybe, for example, I like milk chocolate but don't like dark chocolate. So I will say that this piece of milk chocolate is good and this piece of dark chocolate is bad. All right? So there's a relevant difference there. What he says I cannot do is to have two identical pieces of chocolate with no relevant differences between them and say that one is good and one is bad, because it's inconsistent. All right? So he then says, similarly, we can choose the standards that we live by. It's still subjective. It's not an objective thing. It's my choice. All right? We choose the standards that we live by, but these standards must apply universally. So, for example, I can't say that killing is right in one instance and wrong in another instance if there is no relevant difference between the two situations. Whereas, of course, with Emotivism, that is quite possible, because one is merely saying that one's moral judgments are expressive of one's emotional position at that time. So there's no need for consistency. Hare, on the other hand, talks a great deal about consistency. Right? So standards must apply universally if we have made a particular choice to have a certain standard. All right. So if it is wrong to steal from me because it infringes my rights of ownership, then I must think that it's wrong for me to steal from you unless I can say there is some relevant difference between the two cases. If there's no relevant difference, then I would just be inconsistent, and that's no good to anybody. All right. So this is one way in which Hare can be used to reply or solve some of the difficulties that Emotivism faced. Okay, so one can still maintain that one's moral standards are subjective, but the requirement that one is consistent means that we can get round the inconsistency objection that was a problem for Hare's Emotivism. Hare makes further arguments to support this idea of consistency. All right? He thinks that consistency in language is a condition of its making sense at all, whether or not you're using moral terms. All right? If we don't apply a word or a phrase consistently, how could it make sense, for example? And he takes colour words as examples. You know, if the book is read is the predicate, and the predicate is, in a sentence, is something that describes something about the subject. So the book is the subject, and is read is the predicate. Is read tells us something additional that we didn't know before about the book. However, if we use this word inconsistently in relation to the same objects, then our linguistic sense collapses. All right. Let's, for example, say, instead of what you've got here in front of you on your screen, let's say that I inconsistently point to books of the same colour but use different words. All right, so let's say we've got, I don't know, 5 red books, but instead of me pointing at each book and saying the book is red, I might say the book is green in one case or the book is mauve in another case, and I am referring constantly to the same colour. Our sense of the colour word itself is just not going to make any sense, all right, because there's no consistency in my application. And now to take my second point, if we say the book is red and inconsistently points to books of different colours, then the meaning of the word red becomes unclear in this sense also. What colour, if any, does it actually refer to? Okay, and so Hare says the same is true for moral claims. Once we have got our own standards, once we've chosen what our own standards are, we must then be consistent in our application of our terms right and wrong in relation to those things. We can't just randomly just apply right and wrong inconsistently. All right. So this is a rich area of comparison between emotivism and prescriptivism. Okay, so if you did have a longer answer that asked you to discuss emotivism and prescriptivism, there's a rich area here for discussion. So yes, emotivism allows for inconsistency because emotions are unreliable and I might change my mind from one day to the next. So the requirement of consistency in prescriptivism gets around this problem. Okay. Ethical discussion is more rational if it relies on consistency, and of course it allows for further discussion if there's a disagreement between two people. Both might look for inconsistencies in the other's position, whereas in emotivism, because it allows for inconsistency, that wouldn't be an issue, right? It's just the case, according to emotivists, that morality is inconsistent. But prescriptivism demands that we be consistent once we've set our own standards. Okay. So moral disagreements can be about consistency in applying certain standards. Reason can help solve this, but this is not the case in relation to emotivism. So I'm just reiterating the same point. Further criticisms. Now, we've talked about situations that are not relevantly different. And if you go back to the chocolate example, the idea that we need certain standards means that if I have 2 identical pieces of chocolate, I can't just say that one is good and one is bad. Right? I have to be consistent if I am to make sense. And Hare makes the argument that in our moral judgments, the same thing applies. Right? If we've got 2 situations that are not relevantly different, then once I've chosen my moral standards, I must be consistent in my applications of right and wrong in relation to each. Okay? But there is a problem here, because what does Hare mean by not relevantly different? All right? It's fairly easy to judge what not relevantly different means in terms of chocolate. We can look at the ingredients and so on. There are facts to which we can appeal that show whether or not the 2 pieces of chocolate are the same or not. But in moral situations, we can't do that. Right? There are all sorts of things at play. All right? Certain people may see certain things in the natural features that others may not. Okay? The facts may give rise to any number of differing interpretations, and there will also be an element of agent choice, that is, the person choosing in terms of what counts as relevantly similar and relevantly different. Okay? So you might have a whole range of evidence, and some people will put more emphasis on some aspects of the evidence. Others may not even see some parts as evidence where others will, and so on. And so what will happen is that, as I say, you will get a differing range of interpretation of the same set of facts, and different people may disagree in terms of what counts as relevantly similar or relevantly different features in two situations. Okay. So one person may claim that every situation is unique, and another may see certain similarities between them. Okay. It could be even that a person who says that every situation is unique may very well recognize that there are similarities between situations, but the very fact that they occur at a different time, or maybe the same things occurred but in a different place, the different time and the different place is enough to say that those two situations are relevantly different. Whereas someone else might say, well, the same event occurred, yes, it was at a different time, and yes, it was in a different place to the event that occurred last week, but everything else was the same. They might say that there is no relevant difference, that the situations are to all intents and purposes the same. So again, it's down to interpretation, all right? And we can't just say, uncontroversially, that a situation or two different situations rather are not relevantly different. Similarly, obviously, one could be a fanatic or terrorist, but provided one is a consistent terrorist or a consistent fanatic, all right, one can justify what one is doing, morally speaking. Okay, so a terrorist could be a model of Hare's theory. A terrorist could be a model of moral behaviour, provided he or she could justify it in terms of internal consistency, and that seems very strange. All right, because just because something is internally consistent surely doesn't mean that it's right. But of course, Hare is a subjectivist, and so he believes that once you have chosen your set of values, then provided you are consistent in your application of moral terms in relation to that particular set of standards that you've chosen, then you are acting morally. All right. So yeah, in principle, a terrorist could act morally provided they were internally consistent and not self-contradictory. Similarly, you might ask, is someone morally wrong because they are inconsistent in terms of the application of their moral statements and actions? Or are they morally wrong in the light of the meaning of what they do? Okay, so Hare obviously is demanding consistency, but does it mean that somebody who is inconsistent is therefore, in some sense, morally wrong with themselves because they're inconsistent in terms of the applications of their moral statements and actions? All right. Others may say that this inconsistency problem should be just solved by saying, look, we should be looking at the meaning of what people do, not whether it's internally consistent or not. And of course, that's something that Hare seems to not recognise. So, to summarise Prescriptivism's key points, moral words are not emotive in meaning, but are rather prescriptive. Prescriptive language commands or commends certain events, actions, or characteristics according to a set of standards. So you think about my chocolate example, or the idea that once we've chosen our moral standards, then we have to consistently apply moral terms in relation to situations that are not relevantly different. Moral language can be used descriptively if the speaker doesn't agree with standards. Okay. And finally, description and prescription are logically distinct. This is why you cannot infer an ought from an is. Standards apply universally, thus speakers must be willing to universalize their moral judgments. Prescriptivism also enables us to infer one moral judgment from another, as prescriptions are logically related to each other, and they're logically related to each other because they are based in the series of standards that we ourselves have chosen. All right. So once we've got a set of standards, we can then use logic to infer one moral judgment from another, as long as we take into account things like relevant differences or similarities when talking about particular situations. So here are some questions, and I have attached these to the lesson itself in a Google Doc, so you can try answering them yourself. But just to give you a verbal idea of what they are. Identify one similarity and one difference between Emotivism and Prescriptivism. So that would be a 3-mark question. A 5-mark question will be explain and illustrate the view that moral language is prescriptive. Another 5-mark question, outline and illustrate one theory of how moral judgments influence how we act. So you could use Emotivism or Prescriptivism in this case. So briefly explain what Prescriptivism is. And apologies for not putting is on the end of that sentence. As ever, I've put some extra reading on the lesson as well as the Google Docs with the questions on. Do please read through that and use it to help you if there's anything that you have not understood in this video.